All right, while folks are still joining us, let me welcome all of you to this session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we will discuss Sarah Percy's new book, Forgotten Warriors, The Long History of Women in Combat. Congratulations, Sarah, and welcome to the Washington History Seminar. We're also very fortunate to have with us Professors Audrey Kurth-Cronin and Charlie Carpenter, who will provide initial comments and begin our discussion. To both of you, a warm welcome as well to the Washington History Seminar. I'm Christian Osterman. I direct the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program, and I have the privilege to co-chair the seminar with Eric Arneson of the George Washington University. Today, Eric will introduce our speakers and moderate the discussion. The Washington History Seminar is a collaborative effort of our two organizations, the American Historical Association and the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program. For now, well more than a decade, the seminar has served as a nonpartisan forum for the discussion of important new historical insights and findings. Behind the scenes, there are two individuals who have produced this event, Rachel Wheatley for the National History Center and Peter Bierstecker for the Wilson Center. Our thanks to both of them. We'd like to acknowledge our supporters and welcome your support. Details about how to support the seminar will be available in the chat in Zoom right now, or simply go to our institutional websites. This time of year is giving time. We welcome your donations. Finally, please join us this coming Monday, December 11th, for discussion of Matthias Fiebinger's Suharto's Cold War, Indonesia, Southeast Asia, and the World. Just a couple of technical remarks before I turn this over to Eric. Today's session will be recorded and will soon appear on our organization's websites. For the Q&A part of this webinar, you have two possibilities to join the conversation. Our preferred ways for you to use the raise hand function in the Zoom functionality and press the button once you're entered into a queue and you're asked by the moderator to unmute yourself. That's our preferred way, but you can also post a comment or question in the Q&A function in Zoom, and then Eric will put your questions and comments to our speakers. With that, I turn the Zoom room over to my co-chair, Eric Arneson. Eric, all yours.
Thank you, Christian. And good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Sarah Percy, Associate Professor of International Relations at the University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia. She received her master's and doctorate from Balliol College, Oxford, where she was the Commonwealth Scholar. Her first book, Mercenaries, The History of a Norm in International Relations, was published by Oxford University Press in 2007. And that book traced the origin and development of a norm against mercenary use from medieval time to the war in Iraq. She has published extensively on maritime security, particularly piracy and organized crime at sea, and her research on Somali piracy was featured in the production notes of the film Captain Phillips. And today, she will be speaking on her new book, Forgotten Warriors, The Long History of Women in Combat. Sarah, welcome to the Washington History Seminar.
Okay, well, first of all, let me acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from the lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people here in Brisbane, and I'd like to acknowledge their ongoing contribution of their elders past, present, and emerging. I'm speaking to you today about my new book, as Eric mentioned, and I'll start by telling a little story about the book, which I think will set the stage. So in the late 19th century, archaeologists discovered a beautifully preserved Viking settlement in Sweden. And in this settlement, they found, it was a military-oriented settlement, they found one of the best examples of a grave of a Viking warrior that had hitherto been discovered. And they knew it was a warrior's grave because, as you can see in this picture, it had all of the accoutrement one would expect in the graves of a high-status warrior. So it had weapons, it had a horse, it had armor. There were lots and lots of signals that this was indeed a significant warrior. And no one really thought to look at the grave more closely from the late 19th century until the 1970s, when someone sort of gazed at the skeleton in a little bit more detail and thought, doesn't really look like a male skeleton. But again, nobody really picked up on that either. And until the 2000s, when our DNA techniques became sufficiently advanced, people took a closer look at the skeleton using DNA analysis and found out that indeed the skeleton was a woman. And at that point, for the first time in well over 100 years, people started saying, well, maybe this isn't a warrior at all. Maybe this is a housewife who accidentally got caught up in this grave with all of these weapons. Or maybe this is there must be some other explanation. In fact, there was probably no other explanation. And this was, in fact, a woman warrior who was buried in Viking times in a way that acknowledged her status as a warrior. And this little story I found, as I've done the research and written the book, is one of countless numbers of stories where women's military contributions have been either glossed over by history and sometimes even deliberately forgotten and suppressed. And how I got into this research area and really started to think about it was I wanted to know the answer to this particular puzzle, which is in the American context in particular, in a Western liberal democracy otherwise committed to gender equality. Somehow, the profession of arms is the only profession that we can imagine which is actively banned for women through to the 21st century. I mean, maybe religious figures, but other than that, there are no other professions where women are actively banned. And indeed, the US is able to train and deploy women astronauts into space 30 years before they're able to employ female combat soldiers. And this struck me, as a good social scientist with an active interest in history, as an important puzzle to understand. And to answer this puzzle, you have to go back to traditional military history. But when I did that, I found that the traditional military history wasn't actually as helpful as you might think. Because when you do your research, in particular, in traditional military history books, and you look up women in the index, this is often what you find. There's no entry for women, but there's an entry for whores, or there's an entry for prostitutes. So there is a belief that where women were on the battlefield, they were there only really to provide sexual services for men. And one of the things I'm going to tell you about is those women were indeed on the battlefield, and they were indeed providing services. Some of them may have been sexual, but a great many of them were much more significant and important to military affairs than that. In the book, I argue that this ongoing exclusion of women from combat, both in its active form, so actively preventing women from taking on combat roles, and in the suppression and glossing over and eliding of women's previous combat history, actually has a very important and dramatic effect on wider gender equality in society. Because the message that it sends to women is that despite what the feminist movement may have been telling women since the 60s, women are not equal in this very significant way. They may be equal in all other ways, but in the sense of being able to fight and defend your own country, that is not a job that women can do because they're not good enough to do it. And therefore, the job has to be done by men. So I think that overturning this view by looking back at the history is actually a crucially important task for us. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to run through this history and some of the key arguments of the book. And I'm going to tell you that the battlefield of the past doesn't actually look the way that we think that it did often. And in fact, we see that before the 19th century, there were actually plenty of women on the world's battlefields. Not all of these women were fighting, but the ones who weren't fighting were up close to the action in a way that people often find very surprising. So the picture of the woman with the apron on, she is a vivandière, that is a French supplier of food and drink on the battlefield. They existed as an adjunct to the French army right up until the turn of the 20th century. And these women were not behind the lines by any means. The delivery of these goods had to happen at the front, and these women were often at the front. And we have examples, which I talk about in the book, of when these women needed to pick up arms in order to participate in the fight, and they usually did so, and they were often rewarded for their efforts. We also have lots of examples of women who dress up as men in order to fight. And these are particularly prominent on both sides of the American Civil War. And the picture in the middle is Albert Cashier, who is actually a woman called Jenny by birth and participated in the Civil War. And her story was only uncovered when she fell ill many years later and wanted to have a military pension. So what we find is that there are lots and lots of women on the battlefield, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I think these women matter. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to tell you that there's like loads of secret regiments of women lurking in the battlefields of the past. That's not the case. And yes, when women are there, they're there in small numbers. But this doesn't mean that they don't matter. It means that we have historical evidence that despite arguments to the contrary that were being made that are still being made now, and were being made very prominently as recently as 10 or 15 years ago, that there is evidence that women were perfectly capable of surviving and even thriving on the battlefields of the past, just as the way that men do. And it also reminds us that a great many of these women are not simply victims of war. They're people who had agency and made choices about their own destinies. And I think that this is a very important sort of corrective to this broader military history, which has tended to exclude women. So I'm going to focus on three aspects of the book. Unfortunately, in my 20 minutes, I can't tell you about all of it, but I'm going to focus about three sort of broad themes of the book. And that's going to tell you about how women were actually successful military leaders. I'm going to talk about women's agency and how they weren't just victims of war. And I'm going to talk about women's bravery and physical capabilities in terms of being able to survive on the battlefield and in combat. So I'll begin by telling you about women generals. Now, women generals are few and far between. This shouldn't surprise us because, after all, generals are a very small subset of all of the soldiers who fight, but we do have examples of female generals. And what I find interesting about these generals is that, generally speaking, history and their contemporaries found a way to dismiss them. And I'll talk to you very briefly about the two most famous examples, who are Joan of Arc and the Celtic warrior queen from Roman times, Boudica, who were both dismissed, even though we know that they had military capability. Joan of Arc, of course, her abilities could only be explained by magic, either divine magic or the fact that she might have been a witch, depending on which side of the conflict that you were on. Boudica was dismissed by the Romans as a barbarian. But the general I really want to talk to you about is Queen Jinga, who is there on the bottom. She was a queen in what is now Angola during the 17th century. She ruled for a period of time roughly the same length as Elizabeth I in England. And in a context that makes Game of Thrones look like a kindergarten picnic, there were constant warfare, constant shifts of power, and constant warfare between and among different adversaries. So between colonial interference and between local adversaries as well. And through this entire period, Jinga ruled with incredible capacity. She was widely considered to be Portugal's chief adversary in the region, and she managed to do so for 40 years. Now, why don't we know about Jinga? Well, race and gender is why we don't know about Jinga. She was dismissed for both her gender and some fairly eye-popping practices for Western observers. She apparently did grind up babies in a giant mortar and pestle to make a paste to render her immortal. And needless to say, the missionaries that observed this were fairly horrified. But she became a byword for sort of salacious sexuality. And in fact, the Marquis de Sade refers to her in some of his writings as sort of an example of almost a Black Widow figure who devours her lovers after the fact. So she's lost to us as an example of extraordinary female capacity because we've managed to dismiss what she can do. And I'll argue throughout the book and throughout the talk today that we often see this. When we see a woman who's fighting, whether or not she's a general, we find a way to dismiss that contribution, say, oh, it's just an exception, or it can be explained away in this way. Whatever it is, it's not demonstrated female capacity for combat. The other place we see women performing significant leadership roles and significant combat roles is in sieges. And one of the things I found startling when I researched the book is the fact that sieges were actually the predominant form of military action in Europe for an incredibly long period of time. And in siege warfare, female contributions are common because people are defending their own cities and women pick up arms to fight. We have lots of stories of women on the battlefields, battlements of a city, chopping off arms, chucking boiling oil, grabbing weapons, defending the city. We also have examples of when women are in charge of major households, such as in the English Civil War, taking on the command of that household. And indeed, proper household management was part of the task of a highborn lady. So you needed to know how to defend your house. So if your husband or your son were away fighting, then you could defend the house. And we have two examples. In fact, one of the longest sieges in the English Civil War was led by a woman. And when I say led, I mean making decisions about when and where to deploy the guns, making decisions about when to sally forth out of the household. So this is another area where we tend to dismiss this contribution because people have said, oh, it's not a proper battlefield. So these women are fighting, but it's because they're defending their own homes. It's because they're defending their cities. We can't count this as an example of evidence of women's aptitude for combat. I also want to really highlight the idea that women are brave, they're physically capable, and they have agency. So we've talked a little bit about women who dress up as men. The picture of the head dangling over there is a English cross-dressed soldier called Anne Miller, and she actually ran away to sea. We have both naval and land examples of this in pretty much every European army. We often know about these women because they applied for and successfully received pensions after their military service. One of the things that's fascinating about the cross-dressing, and I'm very happy to entertain questions about this, including the fake penis, which was often a necessary form of the disguise. One of the reasons why that I find what makes them so engaging is that very often they were discovered while they were fighting, and they usually weren't sent home. In fact, we know that they tended to just stay with the unit because they'd already proved themselves, and people actually weren't worried about their ability to fight. The other example we have is the camp followers, the so-called prostitutes that I mentioned earlier. These are women who were actually providing essential logistical support to the military, and they were doing so at the front line in a way that demonstrated their huge physical capacity. So they were known for carrying incredibly heavy loads. They were known for rushing to the front to aid their husbands. They were known for picking up weapons when the person firing them had dropped them. So again, this is an example of women's actual physical capability. And in the middle, we have one of the famous Dahomey warriors. Dahomey is now Benin in West Africa. And they had an all-female regiment that the crack troops, the special forces, if you like, of Dahomey, for a period of about 100 years, were in fact an all-female regiment that were pretty terrifying. And the soldiers of the French Foreign Legion who fought against them were actually blown away by their military capacity. So we do have lots of examples of where women were either given or took the opportunity themselves. They were able to fight and demonstrate that they had the sort of physical characteristics that you might need in order to fight. So if this is all true, I think we all have to ask the question of what changed and how did we end up with a picture of a battlefield as an all-male space, so much so that women are legally barred from combat in most Western societies after the end of the Second World War. And I think two things change. The first is warfare itself changes. So there's no question that the late 19th century warfare is a much more organized affair than what came before. And that includes things like conscription with physical checks, where your fake penis is unlikely to pass muster. And so women were blocked from service in that sense. But also, you didn't need, once states were able to provide military logistics themselves, you didn't need sort of a relatively disorganized ad hoc form of military support, which contained a lot of women in it. And so the battlefield of the past, where women were present, was rightly considered to be inefficient and replaced by something that was militarily superior. And the reason why I have the picture of the mustache there is around this time also many European armies had mustache regulations about the size and shape of the mustache that you were required to wear as a soldier. And obviously, once you start mandating mustaches, it becomes quite difficult to successfully masquerade as a man. The other thing that changes is broadly notions of femininity and the developing middle class really changes in the European and Anglosphere context, where once the model of femininity for the middle classes becomes very delicate and wearing the tight corset and fainting and all of the rest of it, and once the aspirational middle class becomes larger and larger, that dominant view of femininity really cuts against women's capacity on the battlefield. It would indeed probably be immoral or highly irregular to send a very, very delicate woman who is prone to fainting because of her tight corset to the front. And once this really sort of takes hold across Europe and across the Anglosphere, it really changes the possibilities for women. Of course, then, so militaries largely by the turn of the century have excluded women one way or the other. So the French are no longer using that logistical support that I talked about. But World War I creates a challenge for states. And that's no one expects the war famously to last as long as it does. But once it becomes clear you're going to require total social mobilization, how do you mobilize your whole society while keeping women out of combat, which is what you have decided that you need to do? And what's interesting about this is that the very concept of home front, that language that you use, and its French and German equivalents, derive from World War I. And they derive from putting a fence around what women are and aren't allowed to do. And that fence is drawn at the front line where combat happens, and the home front where women are allowed to serve, but in a non-combat capacity. One of the things I argue in the book is that this line between non-combat and combat becomes crucially important to keeping women out of combat. And we can see states and militaries throughout the 20th century and beyond manipulating and altering this definition of frontline and this definition of combat in order to make sure that women aren't doing it. There were still exceptions even in this most masculine of wars, and I won't talk about this in the interests of time, but if anyone wants to ask me a question about this extraordinary woman, Marie Marvin, who, among other things, followed the Tour de France and completed it behind all of the men and served in various capacities in World War I, would love to tell you about it. So what we see in the 20th century is the birth of the formal combat exclusion. And that's the belief that women must be barred from participating in combat. And we see this happening in practice in World War I and World War II, and then in law by the end of World War II. And part of the reason why it has to happen in law by the end of that war is another one of the central guiding puzzles of my book, which is why do only some combatant states in World War II mobilize women and others not? So what we see is all these states are fighting an existential war where we would expect that they would pull out all the stops and throw everything at it, but they do so differently. So in the USSR, we have between 800,000 and 1 million women under arms. In the UK, something different, and in Germany and the US, something different again. So Soviet women serve in pretty much every role you can think of in the military, in the Red Army, and in combatant roles in command of men. They serve with great distinction. They are rewarded for their efforts. British women sort of skirt combat, if you will. They are allowed to work in anti-aircraft batteries, but they're not allowed to fire the guns. The men who work in those batteries fire the guns. The men guard the battery with a weapon. The women guard it with a shovel handle. We have women who are clearly engaged in combat as agents of the Special Operations Executive, but officially they're not in combat, even though they're taught to kill people with their bare hands and sometimes command thousands of French resistance fighters. German women are actually permitted to do very little right until the very, very end of the war. And in fact, there is notable enthusiasm for deploying boys as young as 13 and 14 prior to the mobilization of adult women. And in the US, where there was very, very little manpower pressure on the war, there was very little consequent pressure to challenge these ideas that women shouldn't fight. So we saw very little of it. We saw two experimental issues, one, anti-aircraft batteries, which were a success, but were actually subsequently not spoken about, and also women transport pilots repositioning aircraft. But you could see the sort of tone of the debate here, where a lot of people in Congress thought that the right thing to do with these women was to have a splendid corps of volunteer hostesses rather than having them do anything significant. But after the war, no matter how many women were deployed and in what capacity, there was this very sharp shift back to so-called normal, where people were wanting to return to what a pre-war society looked like and wanting to make it very clear what women were not allowed to do in the military. So worldwide, you have very little official recognition and remembrance of women's military contributions. Mostly that doesn't come into the 1980s, in some cases even later. You have explicit legal bars on women's combat service in a variety of places. You have the numbers of total women in the military are capped on average about 2% across Western militaries, and women are banned from weapons use, which only begins to alter usually in the late 1970s in most of these countries. So how do we get from there to where we are now? And this is what I talk about in the last phases of the book. So I think there's no doubt that keeping women out of combat was rendered easier by the nature of the Cold War and these Western societies who were much more rarely engaging in expeditionary warfare. And But I think the really interesting question is what causes things eventually to change. And I think it's really important to note, and I have a whole section about this in the book that I won't go into in much depth today, that women are a normal part of a different type of warfare, again, one that maybe don't count when we consider examples of female aptitude to combat, and that's in rebel and insurgent warfare, where women remain very common, and that's a cross-national commonality, where women fighters in rebel movements are generally allowed. Like their sisters in World War II, however, for the most part, particularly through the 70s and 80s, their combat contributions ended as soon as the war ended, and they were often actually really placed back into very traditional roles at the end of the war. So the combat exclusion in Western societies is extremely strong, but it must contend with feminism. So it has a challenge of the feminist movement, while not really knocking hard at this particular restriction, is the wider sense in society is that it's no longer sustainable to discriminate on grounds of gender. So there is pressure on militaries to begin to change. But one of the really interesting questions is why militaries, again, managed to resist this for so long, well into the 21st century. And we see lawsuits in particular in the United States, but also in other countries, as a key vehicle for overturning other bars to female participation, but not in this case. And I think it's partly because of a general lack of enthusiasm among the feminist movement, especially in the 1970s, where it was very closely tied with pacifism, so therefore not really a priority for the feminist movement. What we see prolonging the exclusion of women from combat is manipulations of the definition of combat, which is something that I've alluded to before. And what you see is these inordinately complex, almost Baroque definitions of what constitutes combat. And this is an example from the US military, but we see them in other militaries as well. And also you can see by the shifts in what roles are and are not considered combat, demonstrating really how malleable that definition is. And one of the reasons why I have my little carpentry picture here is for a whole chunk of time, a carpenter was considered to be a frontline combat position, but a woman who was driving a truck wasn't. Now that's sustainable as long as your woman is driving the truck somewhere where there isn't a war happening. But as soon as that woman is driving a truck in a combat zone, obviously she's going to pick up a weapon to defend herself and the truck if necessary. And this is, of course, what begins to happen through the early 1980s, a little bit in Grenada, and then in the first Gulf War, where a lot of these distinctions are blown apart by the fact that the US military has women in it, partly courtesy of the feminist movement, albeit not officially in combat. But once placed in a combat zone, women are experiencing combat, even if it's not called combat. And they're also experiencing the kinds of dangers and concerns that policymakers were really worried about, such as being taken prisoner. So that's Rhonda Corman, the helicopter pilot who was famously held captive in Iraq. So there are changes as a result of this. In the US, the Air Force has changed, but not the infantry. Women are allowed into the Air Force, and there's a presidential commission after the first Gulf War, which investigates women's roles in combat and decides that it's not possible, and that there is indeed no historical evidence of women successfully being in combat, and says things like this. You know, we looked into this, we found women really lacked upper body strength. And when we looked at the Soviet case in particular, we found that there were instances of women being killed because they couldn't throw grenades effectively. Well, if you look at the history of women in the Red Army, I did find some examples of women being killed by grenades, but these are the examples. So these are women who were killed by grenades, but in acts of extremely conspicuous bravery. So, you know, they weren't looking at the historical record with an eye to seeing what women actually did. They were looking at a historical record, trying with the lens of sort of looking at what they wanted to find. I argue finally in the book that the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan fundamentally blow apart the combat exclusion, that the 360-degree battlefield, the nature of women's engagement, the use of women in specialized female engagement teams meant that the combat exclusion was becoming a hindrance strategically and a nonsense in reality, because you had women who were being decorated for valor who were not officially in combat. And this ultimately, in the UK context, in the US context, and in the Australian context, is what finally eliminates the combat exclusion. I just want to finish briefly by talking about the fact that one of the other reasons why I think this is important is the links between women, gender equality, and democracy in general. So we know that authoritarian states tend to roll back women's rights as one of the first things they do. Democratic backsliding often begins with the shutdown of women's rights. And what we see in the war in Ukraine, for example, is the Russian military, which used to contain, as we found, lots of women, now has no combatant women in it and very few women in it at all, and in fact are relying on people they've pulled out of jail rather than mobilizing women. Whereas Ukraine, particularly after 2014, really accelerated its use of women and allowed women in all combat roles, and about 20% of Ukrainian forces are female. And again, the sky has not fallen in, and what we found is that men and women are perfectly capable of serving alongside each other. Some people are really good at fighting, male or female. Some people may be less good at fighting, male or female, but gender appears not to be the defining factor. So that takes me to the end of what I wanted to say, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion, and thank you all so much for coming.
Sarah, thank you so much. Our first discussant this afternoon is Charlie Carpenter, professor in the Department of Political Science and Legal Studies at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where she specializes in international law and human security, and she serves as director of the Human Security Lab, an interdisciplinary initiative focused on science and the human interest. Her teaching and research interests include the protection of civilians, laws of war, humanitarian affairs, humanitarian disarmament, global advocacy networks, political violence, and the role of pop culture in global security. She is the author of a number of books: Lost Causes, Agenda Vetting in Global Issue Networks, and The Shaping of Human Society, published by Cornell University Press in 2014, Forgetting Children Born of War, Setting the Human Rights Agenda in Bosnia and Beyond, Columbia University Press, 2010, and Innocent Women and Children, Gender, Norms, and Protection of Civilians, published by Routledge in 2006. She has served as a consultant for the United Nations, the U.S. State Department, the Department of Defense, and the human rights NGO community, and she's a biweekly columnist for World Politics Review and a regular contributor to Foreign Policy and Foreign Affairs. Charlie, welcome to the Washington History Seminar.
Good to be here, Eric. Thank you for that lovely introduction. Thanks to everyone in the audience for coming. Thank you to the seminar organizers for the opportunity to read and comment on this fantastic new book. And thank you, Sarah, for writing it. I encourage anyone listening to read it. It is readable, engaging, incredibly detailed, and unquestionably timely. And aside from being a piece of historical scholarship, it is an intriguing work that will feed into political science as well. Sarah is, of course, a political scientist, and she's building on years of older work on how international norms evolve in relation to laws and institutions and other norms. So I think at the core of this detailed history, Sarah and I are both norm scholars. So when I read this book, what jumps out for me is the really intriguing puzzle, which is why and how this norm arose, given that it actually goes against not only sociobiological and military reality, but also, in some cases, military necessity. Why do states forego the recruitment of half their population's social and human capital, even in existential wars? And why has this set of norms been so resistant to change? Sarah had addressed a question like this in an earlier article in the Journal of Global and Security Studies. Maybe that launched this project, and it's an example of research on counterproductive or bad norms, which is always so helpful in my discipline and sometimes unexpected, since political scientists tend to study norms that we like. But so looking at how difficult it can be to replace unsavory norms with those that are more based on evidence or updated human rights standards, it just begs all kinds of interesting questions about how the world got rid of other antiquated notions like slavery, or whether in reality it ever really did, etc. Anyway, as a political scientist and not a historian, I want to focus my remarks and queries on this wider issue of norms and norm change, and just invite thinking on the panel about this combat exclusion norm and the wider institutional and normative milieu in which it's situated, because I think that can tell us an even richer story about what's happening here, but also it can give us clues as to what theoretical insights we can take from this specific historical case that may help us as social scientists with thinking about even broader category of of normative phenomena in international affairs. So in both respects, I had a few questions on which I'd love Sarah to focus a bit in her response as the spirit moves her. And the first, about the institutional context in which this norm is changing or unraveling, or just transmogrifying. The book situates these changes in political institutions and in military institutions. As Sarah was just saying, political institutions have become more democratic and gender egalitarian over the centuries, at least in many parts of the world. Military institutions have in some respects also become more civilianized, you might say. And to this I would add, and I think it's perhaps implicit in the book, there's also multilateral institutions that have promulgated extensive norms in recent centuries and decades that connect human rights and humanitarian law standards to domestic security institutions, and which also promote a kind of institutional isomorphism across states. But I was a little bit curious about combat exclusion and points Sarah made at places in the book about democracy and militarization, especially in the conclusion. So, for example, just now, I think on that last slide, she's correctly pointing out that authoritarian government suppression of human rights and promulgation of militarized masculinity through combat exclusion are very interconnected. I'm just not entirely sure about the I'm not sure it's so much different for democracies. Even among Western states that have moderated the combat exclusion, for example, the military draft still applies to men selectively. Only my son and not my daughter has to sign up for the selective service. And that's a notable implication of this older norm, even though it's a little bit of a different thing. And the Ukraine war, it's not only Russia that is solely drafting men and not women, as Percy points out on page 289. Ukraine, it does allow women into combat, unlike Russia, but Ukraine too has a national mobilization law that is targeting primarily men without any safeguards for conscientious objection. And this has been scarcely called out by the international community, even though Ukraine has many other options for recruiting a willing volunteer force of men and women, domestically and abroad. So that's an interesting puzzle. At the military level, Sarah is correctly pointing out the idea that unit cohesion requires male bonding, right? And that this is not only factually incorrect, but it contains a double-edged sword, that male bonding often has taken place through bullying and hazing and the Joint Commission of War Crimes. And I think, I could be wrong, Sarah, but I interpreted what the argument to be really just that there's nothing natural or preordained about this kind of bonding. It's really very socially constructed. But I wonder if it can read also like, or be interpreted, maybe misinterpreted, as an equally factually incorrect narrative that if only women were incorporated in, we would have a healthier kind of cohesion that would not rely on the Group Commission of War Crimes. And I think there's some evidence to the contrary. Dara Cohen's work, for example, it has found that female fighters in Sierra Leone are just as likely to commit crimes, including sexual violence, on female and male civilians as are male fighters. And that in neither case, the reason is the same. It's about the need to bond troops together in a sense of joint identity through the Commission of War Crimes. And she finds what predicts this is less gender and more just bonding. It's about whether the troops are recruited voluntarily or forcibly conscripted, how much you need to do that kind of thing to get them to bond, etc. So on the one hand, this can support the point that you can create unit cohesion in mixed gender groups and that militarization doesn't depend on masculinity. On the other hand, militarization can come with its own baggage. And so I think an interesting, maybe unanswered question here is, what are the pathways or mechanisms for integrated armed forces to render some of that baggage less trenchant? We probably want to be modest in our conclusions here, because war may simply be hell no matter who is fighting it. And I'm curious about how things can get misinterpreted because people think of gender in such a dichotomized way. Both these points beg the other question about the relationship between the combat exclusion norm and other norms. Something which is, I think, also implicit in the book, but maybe not as explicit as it might be, or as I personally wish it were. So I'll just take this chance to ruminate on that a bit, which is to say, I think a big piece of the why story might be that the perception that women can't fight is imbricated not just in the combat exclusion norm itself, but in a number of wider norms in international relations that are adjacent. So I think maybe the unraveling of this combat exclusion assumption will be connected to not just women's ability to serve, but some other dynamics that connect armed conflict to state security and human security of individuals. So if these bundled norms then have a recursive influence on one another and make some kind of gendered dysfunction more intractable than is wise, then I wonder, Sarah, what your thoughts are on how unraveling this one, and I think your book is helping contribute to unraveling it by showing the historical facts, how unraveling one might affect the others. And so the norm you talk about, the adjacent norm you talk about in the book, is the norm of gender equality itself, right? Which is to say that feminists were split on the importance of combat equality, but they were split on so many things. I mean, the feminist movement has never been unified. So I'm not 100% convinced that was the key factor here. So I wonder if there was more to it, or if this factor interacted in some way with others. One that comes to my mind is this other important adjacent set of norms that were also developing and strengthening during the 20th century, which is the norm of civilian immunity itself. This idea that you have combatants and you have civilians, and you want to direct war against combatants. And this is technically, it's theoretically a sex-neutral norm. The Geneva Conventions do not define it in gendered terms, but because of the gendered social assumption that women can't fight, this notion of the civilian sector is often understood to be mostly women and children, and we use that term a lot in the media to this day. And the general neglect of combatant women and civilian men reflects that, even though the Geneva Conventions specifically anticipate there might be persons of each gender in both these populations. So my own work and that of other scholars, Laura Schoberg, Adam Jones, and Catherine Krept, a lot of research has shown that this gendered assumption complicates or undermines efforts to protect the civilian population generally, and feeds into belligerent narratives that military-age men and boys are actually in the military. They're actually fighters or potential fighters, and therefore legitimate targets in ways that can produce massacres like we saw at Srebrenica in 1995, or Bucha in 2022, or the sex-selective targeting of Pakistani and Somali men in the War on Terror by signature strikes by drones in the US. So these are assumptions that are often not very questioned. They're often reiterated even by civilian protection advocates and NGOs, even though they kind of paradoxically undermine the civilian protection norm itself, which requires belligerents not to make some gender assumptions. It requires belligerents to actually note who is under arms and actually fight it, not rely on gendered scripts. But these gendered scripts can play not just into the question of civilian immunity, that is, who can be lawfully targeted, but also norms of masculine warriorhood, what men as well as women not only can't do, but have to do in war. In ways that constrain men's freedom to flee a conflict, for example, which is something we see not just in Ukraine, but in other places, or to refuse service, or to engage in peace activism, or simply to make the choice whether or not to remain in the civilian sector. So I think the combat exclusion rule, it doesn't simply discriminate against women. It also creates this permissive context in which reluctant men and teenage boys are often pressed into service, even as capable, invested female fighters are still excluded in many cases. So this just creates a state of affairs that's bad for everyone, and maybe especially for children. But it also puts moral tension on these other norms that are also designed to protect non-combatants. And what I wonder is whether decoupling these norms from gender will have that neutralizing effect on strengthening those norms, or if they're just going to result in more confusion and weaker norms altogether. I know practitioners and observers disagree, so I wonder, as a political scientist, if you have thoughts on this. How am I doing on time, Eric? I could dwell a little more on Ukraine, but I can also wrap up.
I'm going to suggest that you wrap up and perhaps bring up Ukraine when we get to the discussion portion, because there will be time for that.
Sure.
And this way we'll give Sarah a chance to respond to what you say, and then we'll continue the conversation.
Yeah, that's very, very good. So I guess my main question and reaction is, it seems to be the combat exclusion norm. It's really comes across as a very sticky norm in the book. And that's fascinating to me, but I'd love to know more about Sarah's ideas on the why, as well as the how, because I wonder if it's contributing through knock-on effects also to the stickiness of many other outdated gender assumptions that related to the norms of war. And I'm just interested in Sarah's thoughts on this, because I know she's written so widely on war and norms more generally. And the book does an extraordinary job on the how of women's erasure. I'm not entirely sure I'm satisfied about the big puzzle as to why this norm arose and has stuck around more than others. I'm really interested in her thoughts on that. Even though as a work of history, maybe that's not the book's key remit, but I'm just interested in her thoughts as a political scientist. And I guess I'm most interested in whether how much power youth can predict this combat exclusion norm will have in ungendering these wider clusters of rules, if it ungenders, and how we evaluate that. And secondly, what you think this case of norm stubbornness, so maybe we could call it, tells us about wider norm dynamics and prospects for norm change in international relations, and how we might look at all that more systematically. So those are the questions I'd leave us with, but I'll just say in conclusion, this was such a pleasure to read, such an important contribution to our understanding of war and social change, and I really look forward to the conversation today. Thank you,
Charlie. Sarah, any thoughts you want to share in response to what Charlie just had to say?
Oh, so many. I will try to keep it brief so we can move on to Audrey and to the wider discussion. But I think that it was funny when I've been working on this book, I've gotten a lot of queries as to why I've written it as a book for a wide audience and not for a smaller scholarly audience. And I always would say to my students, all the stuff is there. It's like those sauces that parents make to trick their children into eating vegetables. The vegetables are all pureed in the sauce. And what Charlie's done is drawn out that puree a little bit, because clearly a lot of these more scholarly ideas are in international relations and political science ideas are informing the backbone of the book, but they're not at the forefront of the book. So the first thing I would say, just for the audience, if you haven't read the book, is that a lot of this stuff is in the book, but it's not the predominant focus of the book. But one of my goals in doing it was to get us to think about all of these things. And I think it is really important for us to query why we have all been okay with the exclusion of women from combat for so long, given that the historical record shows us that women are in fact perfectly capable of fighting. And that speaks to a lot of Charlie's questions. And I think that I can kind of answer them as a collective, and if people want me to expand more on specific aspects, I can do that later. So yes, it's very clear that the norm against female combat is part of a wider complex of other norms, rules, and obligations, right? That fits into all kinds of things. I'm increasingly of the view in my international relations political science capacity that looking at single norms is not helpful, and that we need to look at the way norms are embedded in not just institutions and practices, but also in culture. And in this case, we see norm embeddedness in military culture, and military culture we know to be extremely difficult to change, right? We have tons of literature about how difficult it is to change military culture. And that has to do with everything from the way militaries train to military tradition to that isomorphism that you talk about. So militaries around the world all look the same. They wear similar uniforms. They're organized in a similar fashion. So altering military practice is quite complicated. The other thing that we know that range of feminist scholarship that we've talked about has pointed out is that the military is one of the chief engines of the gender dichotomy in society. So altering the gender dichotomy and altering the military dichotomy, that is a very complex relationship to unpick. And I think, Charlie, you hit on a very interesting question, which is this question of conscription in the draft. So it is absolutely true that most countries will open combat rules to women, but not initially alter the draft. So when we look at the spread of countries who've done this, we see that the first countries, so for starters, not every country maintains a conscription or maintains a draft, but in societies that do, Generally speaking, your Nordic countries, your Western European countries, they've either abandoned conscription or they have begun to conscript women. But they're looking at 30 plus years of experience because they opened combat roles to women in the 80s. So it's a very different understanding of that conscription role. So one of the things I would say about that is that altering the wider sort of constellation of rules comes more slowly. But I think the first step has to be the integration. So I don't think it's going to solve everything. And I think that you're quite right in pointing out that militaries do bad stuff and they break stuff. And we have rules that try and limit and constrain that. But that is the reality. So the war is held, doesn't matter who's doing it. But to affect that wider change, and the variation of the question that I get asked a lot is that, look, war is a really bad thing. Why are we talking about having more people fighting war, whether or not they're female or male, rather than considering whether or not war is a desirable end state for us at all? And I think the answer to this question is that we're always going to be fighting wars, and that clearly some military practices are unhealthy and need changing. Clearly, we want to limit war crimes. Clearly, there are gendered elements to all of this. But unless you open the door by allowing women into combat in the first place, I think it is almost impossible that you're going to affect any of those other changes. It may take a considerable period of time. I fell down quite a considerable rabbit hole on firefighters when I was working on this book, because it's the closest analog that I could come up with to integration of women in combat. And what the firefighter example shows us is that it takes a really long time. So it is a minimum 30-year project, and firefighting is not the same as military tradition in terms of prominence in society, in terms of depth of tradition, and in terms of resistance to change. So I suspect we're looking at a very long road. But yes, I do think there's an enormous degree of interrelation, and that unless we begin to start at the top in a way and say that women can be equal participants in the military, you're not going to get all of those other changes that we might like to see.
Thank you. Before we continue, let me just remind those of you in the audience that you can get in the queue to pose a question, either by using the raise hand function, in which case we'll call on you. You have to unmute yourself, and then you can pose the question directly, or you can use the Q&A function, as a number of people are already doing, in which case I will read the question that you post. Our second discussant this afternoon is Audrey Kurth Cronin, who directs the Carnegie Mellon Institute for Security and Technology at Carnegie Mellon University, where she's also the Trustees Professor of Security and Technology. She's the author of How Terrorism Ends, Understanding the Decline and Demise of Terrorist Campaigns, published by Princeton University Press in 2009. This is a book that the New Yorker called a landmark study. Her latest book, the award-winning Power to the People, How Open Technological Innovation is Arming Tomorrow's Terrorists, published by Oxford in 2020, analyzes emerging technologies and devises a new framework for 21st century military innovation. She served in the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Policy and frequently advises at the senior levels. She was chair of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on Terrorism and is a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Her commentary and analysis frequently appear in such places as Foreign Affairs, International Security Survival, BBC, CNN, NPR, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and other media outlets. Audrey, welcome to the seminar. The screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Eric. And I just want to say what a delight it is to be here. Sarah and I served together at Oxford University in the Changing Character of War program, a program that was and is interdisciplinary and involves a tremendous amount of history as well as political science and law and other disciplines in the university. So it's wonderful to see the appearance of this book, Sarah. I loved the book. It was a true pleasure to read about it, to read about the hidden role of women from the Vikings to the present day. I'm going to give concise comments that take the book on its own terms as something that is addressed toward a general audience. I thought the comments that we just enjoyed about the norms behind the ideas that you've talked about were extremely stimulating, but I think actually, Charlie, you and I are going to work together quite complementarily, because I'm going to take a completely different approach, a little bit more personal and a little bit more historical, and also praise the fact that this is a wonderful book for general audiences to read. It's very accessible. It's very well written. It's something that is quite stimulating. I thoroughly enjoyed it as someone who studies military history, strategy, irregular warfare, and has, Eric said, has worked also with the U.S. military and other government organizations. I really loved learning about the much more prominent role of women that's been hidden all these years. Broader audience members will love it. I commend it to you. I remember, on a personal note, graduating from high school, just as the decision was made in the United States to admit women to the to the U.S. service academies. And I come from a family with very deep connections to the U.S. Navy. I have 3 brothers who are all, or were all, U.S. naval officers, as was my father. And so when I graduated from high school, the first thing I did was get into line to, it was obvious to me that my pathway should be to go to the U.S. Naval Academy. I mean, it was just obvious. And just to tell you, my father came back from Moscow, where he was serving as the U.S. Naval Attaché, and took me out to lunch. I was in the United States going to school. And much to my shock, when we discussed the question, he was against it. And he said, "You'll never command a ship. You'll never fly. You'll never go to sea. You'll never be in combat. Your career will be capped before you even begin." And you know what? He was right. At that time, it was too early. It was the wrong time. So, that was crushing at the moment, but it was also a reflection of the reality at that time. And that reality has significantly changed, at least in the United States. Now, I'm not saying that it's changed enough, but it has been personally very gratifying to me to see the dramatic, particularly at the leadership level, the dramatic changes that have occurred with respect to women's roles. For senior women leaders, now there are role models for young women like myself at that time who want a career in the military. And I truly believe that young women today can achieve anything. They can have that kind of agency that Sarah writes about so beautifully in the book. They can choose to enter those sorts of risks and choose to engage in combat in ways that were only a dream a matter of a few decades ago. So look at 4-star General Laura Richardson, who is the first Army combatant commander of Southern Command in the United States. The Commandant of the U.S. Coast Guard is Admiral Linda Fagan. 4-star Air Force General Jacqueline Van Ovost is commander of U.S. Transport Command. And finally, we have the first, this one really gave me heart palpitations, I have to say, coming from an old Navy family. We have the first female 4-star head of the U.S. Navy, Chief of Naval Operations, recently confirmed, Admiral Lisa Franchetti. Unbelievably inspirational to me. So I enjoyed reading this book in the context of that history that is unfolding before us. These women are in their positions not because they're women, but because they're outstanding leaders, the very best at what they do. And they're inspiring to both the women and the men under their command. And this is wonderful. So anyway, the book beautifully tells the story of why that's unusual, but not necessarily all that surprising in the history of women warriors. I enjoyed every chapter, and my personal favorites were especially the role of women in the U.S. Civil War, the study of women in the First World War, and the role of women defending the Soviet Union in the Second World War. And I would like to just say that I think their role in Russia had a lot more to do with communist ideology than it did with Russian culture. But that's something we can talk about later. Anyway, Sarah, I'm a great admirer of your book. And I commend it to everyone who is watching today. I think you'll really enjoy reading it. It'll be a wonderful thing to read over the holidays. So with all of this as background, Sarah, I do want to ask you 3 quick questions that occurred to me, and then I need to give you some time to talk and also our audience some time to ask their questions. Some of these overlap a little bit with what you said, Charlie, but I will sally forth. So number one, it's not just European warfare itself that changed, but also technology. And I'm not just talking about whether or not we had artillery on the battlefield, but changing technology affected the role of women in the use of violence more generally. And of course, this is close to my heart because my book, Power to the People, is all about this. But, the invention of dynamite in 1867 led to the democratization of access to high explosives, which widened the scope of who could participate in terrorist violence. And it's not an accident that Sofia Perovskaya, who participated in the assassination of Tsar Alexander in 1881, the fact that she was a woman is not an accident because there was much greater access to those kinds of technologies, particularly dynamite in this case. So how has the role of technology changed women's role as warriors, Sarah? That's my first question. Strategic bombing in the Second World War, the use of explosives in guerrilla movements, especially access to the easy-to-use Kalashnikov rifles for female insurgents throughout the post-World War II era. It's not an accident that guerrilla movements have a bigger place for women because they can be extremely effective with a rifle that was built for Russian peasants and made to be extremely easy and almost indestructible and interchangeable in its parts. So that's the first thing. How does this factor, by technology, I'm not just talking about big military technologies, but accessible technologies, democratized technologies in general. How has that affected the role of women as much as cultural political changes, I think? But anyway, that's the first thing. Secondly, you observe at the end of your book that a toxic masculine environment can explain how there have been horrifying war crimes. Charlie has already asked you about this. I'd like to hear you expand on it a little bit more. The My Lai massacre by U.S. soldiers in the Vietnam War, the shocking revelations about war crimes committed by the Australian Special Air Services Regiment in Afghanistan in 2017. What's the evidence to show that women warriors would have mitigated those events? Or, and more broadly, I think there's a lot of evidence on the other side that it really does depend on other factors, not just gender. And Charlie's touched upon that well, and I think you probably might want to expand on that point a little bit more. And then finally, it's not just a patriarchy that has worked against recognizing the powerful women in combat, right? I mean, you emphasize this throughout your book, but there's a lot of other argument on the part of women, be they feminists or very traditional conservative women, strongly against having women in combat. So in fact, when I think back about what was happening when I was a very young woman, it was as much oftentimes other women who did not want women serving next to their husbands or their sons, who somehow felt that this would be a sexualization that they couldn't trust while those men were off fighting wars. Women didn't want other women in units with their husbands or sons. And where does that factor fit into your argument? I agree that there's a patriarchy, but it sure is not a matter of just gender. It's also a matter of, and not just culture either. Some of it is a matter of women's self-interest working against other women, or at least as they define it. So those are my three big questions. I also had a very small point that I wanted to ask you, which was about combat pay. A lot of your discussion about combat versus non-combat service in various militaries, that's always an extraordinarily difficult sort of definition. What is a non-combatant? I mean, ever since World War II, frankly, before the 1500s, there just was no distinction. But so oftentimes what distinguished between something was designated combat or not had to do with whether they wanted to pay people more. So relatively small point. Those are my three bigger points. To end on the most important thing, it's a great book, and everyone in the audience needs to go out and buy it and read it.
Audrey, thank you very much. Sarah, your response.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you so much for that, Audrey, and especially for your enthusiastic endorsement. So I think that I will answer your three questions, and so I'll probably touch on your preamble a little bit as well. So the first one about technology, it's such an interesting question. And actually, I'm working on another project at the moment about guns. And so I've been thinking about this a lot. And I think that it's very clear that the chunk of time I focus on the book, if I wanted to think about it in weapons terms, clearly is mostly after the introduction of gunpowder warfare. And that's because there are clearly physical differences between men and women in their terms of capability. And being a knight would be really hard for a woman because the gear was so heavy, essentially. So that was a period of warfare in which physical strength mattered more. But of course, as soon as you introduce gunpowder warfare, physical strength comes to matter less and less. And then as gun technology gets better and better, that becomes increasingly the case. It's also true, I think, in technological terms, that what we find is that higher technology arms of the military are the first to integrate. So almost universally, the first service to open to women is the Air Force. Because that element of operating the technology, again, there's a perceived view that there's the physical strength issue doesn't enter into it. And of course, we know that there are some ways in which women tend to be more physiologically suited to flying than men, related to physical size. So it's actually helpful not to be 6'5" if you want to be a fighter pilot. So there are definitely technological impetuses there. There's also, I think, some very interesting, thought-provoking things for us to think about level of detachment from killing, that I think probably rests on that a little bit, that the farther and farther away we get from killing, the more likely we are to assume that women are capable of doing it. And I find that really, really interesting. So, you obviously hand-to-hand combat, moving to guns, moving to artillery, moving to drones, moving to air power. So all of that, I think, really ties together in a really interesting way. And of course, one of the things we also know about guns is that when you train women on them, they're very effective. So, for example, one of the women who's on the cover of the book is Lyudmila Pavlichenko, who's an extremely decorated Soviet sniper in World War II. On the question of war crimes, and yes, as you and Charlie have both brought up, I don't think, and I think I say in the book, it's not as simple as add women and stir, right? Like, it's not as simple as we put women in this institution, it will stop committing war crimes. I think what I'm trying to say in the book is that the valorization and the lionization of the idea of unit cohesion as the central defining thing that militaries need to have is very dangerous, because very often that unit cohesion absolutely relies on extremely unpleasant practices. And as Charlie says, we have evidence of those unpleasant practices occurring in mixed gender units as well as non-mixed gender units. One of the things I found when I was doing the research for the book is that the term unit cohesion, if you do a Google Ngram search on it, it doesn't really exist at all until the 1970s, and it doesn't exist in its formulation of organizational cohesion either. And I find this really interesting because in the 1970s, when militaries have to start to work to keep women out of combat, prior to the advent of the feminist movement, there was very little pushback about keeping women out through the 50s and 60s. But once they have to start to work at it, they rely on two arguments. Women aren't physically capable, and they'll upset unit cohesion. Everybody discards physical capability really quickly. Why? Because if you set gender neutral standards, people are going to be able to meet them. Maybe not as many people, but as soon as you set them, they can be beaten. And militaries are very aware of this. And we have actual evidence from this in the US military and the UK military of them discarding this as a strategy. And what do they turn to? They turn to the concept of unit cohesion, because that becomes something, if you say, look, it's this alchemical bond between brothers, it's very hard to argue against that. It's not setting an objective standard that can be beaten, but also you have to lean very hard into it as this thing of almost mythic levels of importance to rely on it. So the story of the change here is very important, because I think lionizing unit cohesion, which was not something that people seemed to worry about at all prior to the 1970s and women trying to get into the military, maybe if we reduce that lionization on the cohesion, we will achieve better impacts overall. And I think that, so, and then the question of the patriarchy. So patriarchy is not an all-male construct, right? So patriarchy can have women in it. And Phyllis Schlafly was definitely a member of the patriarchy. And I have a whole section of the book talking about the very interesting relationship between the Equal Rights Amendment the reintroduction of the Selective Service Act in the 1970s, and how these two things, hand in glove, are highly related to each other. So it appears that the absolute knockdown argument against the ERA, Phyllis Schlafly's most effective tool in her arsenal, was to say your mother, your daughter, your sister will be forced to go and fight if you pass this amendment. And that was the thing that appears to have killed it more effectively than almost any other argument. So it was a very potent weapon for a conservative movement. But, you know, all of these ideas that women often block other women, that they make it more difficult. I think a lot of feminist scholarship would tell you that that's a facet of patriarchy. It doesn't have to necessarily be perpetrated by men. On the question of combat pay, that's really interesting. And it's absolutely true that there is an issue here that women, part of the reason why women wanted access to combat in a lot of militaries was to get access to the pay as well as access to the opportunities. One of the things that I talk about in the book as an interesting and slightly horrifying related point is in British military planning. All the way through World War I and World War II, they had a little ratio that they would work out, which is how many women it would take to replace one man, and therefore consequently how you would pay them. So the idea was that a man could be replaced by 2 women usually, sometimes 3, depending on the nature of the job, and women would then be paid accordingly. So again, this is all of the little tentacles of this that really creep out into different directions and actually really constitute significant gender discrimination. And I think that I have a side academic project at the moment looking at, in answer to both of your questions, looking at why lawsuits have been a remarkably ineffective way to get women into combat. And part of the answer to that is there are surprisingly extremely few of them. And that when they have happened, they don't always succeed. So they often succeed on paper, but then the military acts to block the change afterwards. But anyway, those are my very brief answers. Oh, and I did want to say in relation to your remarks about the service academies. So I also fell into a service academy rabbit hole. Service academies also are a first phase of integration in most societies. It's very hard to justify keeping women out of an educational institute. And so this is how the service academies get integrated in the US, and it's a reasonably similar pattern around the world, that service academies get integrated prior to the combat exclusion being lifted. At the time it happened, they have a memo in the book that I talk about where someone says, basically, this is the thin edge of the wedge. If we let women into West Point, that's it. As soon as they're in West Point, eventually they're going to get into combat. We have to fight this as hard as we possibly can. And they were right, because of course, what happens is that eventually the men who are serving alongside those women at the service academies realize that it's fine. The sky is not falling in. There are not problems. And those problems can be superseded. And then eventually you create a leadership pathway for women. So your dad was right. There wasn't a leadership pathway. But as soon as you create a leadership pathway and you allow people to follow that pathway, then eventually you're going to get those successful stories, which I think are so impressive. And actually such an astonishingly rapid change when you think about it. So thank you. And yeah, we can move on to more questions, I suspect.
Okay, we've got a number of questions in the Q&A, but we also have a hand up. Katrin Schulteis, unmute yourself. Please pose your question.
Yes, thank you. My question has to do with how changing natures of motherhood figure into the questions that you're addressing here. And I'm thinking in particular how in the 19th century, really beginning in the first half of the 19th century in Western nations, you see the increasing emphasis on population and health of population as a measure of national strength. And so the role of women as mothers sort of has now a national dimension and not just a private dimension. So you can talk about Republican motherhood, or in other formats, you see the same thing. So, and that is intensified, of course, in the 20th century, where, especially in the early 20th century, there's literally competitions among nations about population size. You also have panics in various European countries about declining birth rates. And so motherhood becomes this essential factor in national strength. And so I wonder how that factors into the resistance to bringing women into the military, the clear division between men fight for the nation in the field with weapons in the army, women fight for the nation in the home by taking care of their children and bringing up good citizens.
Yeah, so good question. And I think that we see it shifting in importance. So one of the things I think about motherhood now is that's not an argument that explains well what's happening from the 1970s onwards, because there's less of that sort of focus. We do see it very prominently in World War II. So part of the reason why the Germans find it so difficult to mobilize women is that they are lionizing motherhood. So the exact situation you described is what's happening, where Nazi ideology says that women's contribution is in having lots of children. Weirdly, the Soviets managed to do both of these things. So you get orders of valor for having lots of babies, as well as orders of valor for being the most decorated sniper in the war. So they managed to straddle both of these things. But I think that there's clearly a tension if you are very worried about the size of your population, about allowing women to be killed. I have a colleague here at UQ who's an evolutionary biologist, and he always says to me, he's like, so, why would you kill your childbearers? That would be a really big problem. And I think that as we have moved into a more technologically advanced society and a greater understanding of women in the workforce in general, means that we're not as worried about that cult of motherhood. But yes, it's definitely sort of interwoven there throughout, and also interwoven into those changing ideas of femininity that I talked about. I also talk about Empress Maria Theresa in the book, who she sort of revolutionizes Austrian warfare while she is in charge of Austria, and she does so while having, I think, 16 children. And she complains if she hadn't spent so much time being pregnant, she would have achieved even greater heights in her military organization.
Thank you. I'm going to squeeze a question in here, if I may. And a few weeks ago, we had a session with Beth Bailey on her new book, An Army of Fire, that dealt with the U.S. Army in the Vietnam era and the issue of race, African-American soldiers, and issues of promotion, violence, integration, and the like. And she emphasizes in that book and in the presentation the notion that in addition to being a fighting force, the military is also a bureaucracy. It is a large bureaucracy. It generates vast amounts of paperwork. There are countless committees. And thinking about the military as a bureaucracy, I'm then wondering about the mechanisms by which women's advancement occurs from the 70s, 80s, 90s onward. You have some wonderful examples of individuals who push, who bring court cases, who seek advancement. Sometimes they lose, sometimes they win. But within the military itself, as an institution, as a bureaucracy, how does this process fully play out? Let's say just for the United States. Who are the advocates for women and women in combat? We get a clear sense of who's opposing them, but how do they make their case? What case do they make? And how do they go about bringing this change, if in fact this is a key part of the story?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So the first thing I would say, if we're focusing on the US military, is that lawsuits are almost non-existent, right? Like there are very, very few lawsuits that relate to this particular question of combat. There is one lawsuit that happens in the 70s. It's actually brought by a man, and it goes dormant for a while, and then it's brought up again in the late 70s, early 80s as a consequence of the reintroduction of the Selective Service Act. And the lawsuit loses. And that actually puts the kibosh on further lawsuits because it goes to the US Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court decides, the case is called Rotzker versus Goldberg, and the Supreme Court decides in favor of the government in this case, and therefore the legal avenues are few and far between. So what you see is a lot of individual women pushing back. I have a fantastic story. The name is going to escape me, of course, but of a woman who realized there was no rules about, in the early 80s, about a woman taking the US Army Rangers course. The rules didn't say you could, but they also didn't say you couldn't. So she did it. And they failed her on a technicality at the end, and she appealed. and was reinstated. And so she had passed the full US Army Rangers course in the early 1980s. And then they changed the rules to make it so that to make it clear that women were not allowed to take the course. And then that didn't happen again until after the US opened combat roles to women. So there are individual cases of women who push back. But coming back to the comment I just made to Charlie, part of what happens bureaucratically here is the US military and the UK military, who express similar things, are both totally right to say, as soon as you allow women in, there will be no stopping them. Because what happens is people will find a way to move across. And I think in particular, there's a really interesting case about US involvement in Grenada, where they have women military police in significant numbers for the first time. And a bunch of them are flown over from Port Bragg into Grenada. And they're sent by their commanding officer in Port Bragg. They arrive in Grenada. The commanding officer in Grenada says, I don't want any women here. Get back on that plane, go back. They go back to Port Bragg. The guy in charge of Port Bragg is a big advocate of women, and he thinks they're fantastic. And he says, no, you are perfectly capable. You get on that plane and you go back again. So individual champions, I think, probably played a significant role. And then just again, I think you cannot underestimate how significant the Cold War is in relation to this, where if you're not experiencing, so Vietnam happens before the significant changes allowing larger numbers of women into the US military in general. After that, you have a chunk of time where expeditionary war is by and large not happening. And so the idiosyncrasies of how you divide up these positions don't matter so much. Whereas as soon as you place people into active combat in an expeditionary sense, where there's no front line behind which you can safely keep your women, then the complexity of maintaining these differences, which are bureaucratic in a way, becomes almost impossible. And so militaries largely have to give up. And that's a very notable pattern among some of the big Australia, the UK, the US, all of whom were states that were very slow to admit women into combat.
Thank you. We have a question from Karen Turner, who in her own work has worked on female volunteers and the North Vietnamese women in the Indochina War. What I find is that women can work with men and take leadership positions, but the cost to women in terms of reproductive futures is one key gender issue. Women return home to a post-war culture that valorized the Great Mother as the nation needed to replenish its citizens. Many were viewed as damaged, and some were, in fact, tainted by chemicals. In the U.S. context, it's useful to look at nurses. In the Vietnam case, were not able to obtain proper care from the VA, not accustomed to dealing with women's bodies. So there are a number of questions there, but you do have a chapter about women rebels and women who were engaged in insurgencies against various powers, including the United States in Vietnam. If you could just say a little bit more about the non-Western experience and or the insurgent experience with regard to that question.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for being here, Karen. I'm a huge fan of your book and your books, actually, and I relied on your work on Vietnam quite a lot in the book. So it's very exciting to have you here. So thank you for the question. I think that you're absolutely right. And I'll take that aspect of the question first, is that there is no doubt that when, particularly at the point of integration, and particularly in insurgent groups, that the women who integrate, who engage in fighting, bear enormous personal cost. And I think that we don't recognize that enough. And in not recognizing female combat, one of the things that we are not recognizing is those costs. And that goes back to something I wanted to say in response to Audrey as well, is that part of the active remembering that I'm trying to pull together in this book isn't just remembering what women did in the past, it's remembering the process which got us to where we are now, where we have a female four-star, we have multiple female four-star leaders in the militaries. If we don't remember exactly how we got to where we are and exactly the sacrifices that women in particular have made and the personal costs that they have borne, then we run the risk of sort of undermining ourselves and losing track of this all again. So yes, there are very significant personal costs. It is often the case in both regular armies, World War II, we see this, and in insurgent and revolutionary armies, that post-war women are treated extremely badly. So there is often retrogression where women's opportunities are less good than they were before the start of the conflict. As time has shifted, the literature on rebel and insurgent movements suggests that this has also shifted a little bit. There's been a lot more focus, for example, about bringing women into peace processes, whereas previously they were excluded. And we know that we hope that will continue to have more of an impact on gender equality in a society. And the Women, Peace and Security initiatives, peace building initiatives have made a big difference in that regard. So in the question about non-Western societies, I had a sneaky peek and I saw a question about the Rani of Jhansi. The Rani of Jhansi also features in the book. She is an extraordinary character, and I have a long section on her in the book. But we also see women in combat outside Western militaries. In the 20th century, it's predominantly been in rebel and revolutionary movements. Distribution of this is really interesting. So as you might expect, left-wing revolutionary movements are much more likely to have women in combat roles than right-wing revolutionary movements. So Maoist insurgents in Nepal, the Tamil Tigers, the various associated Kurdish forces, various Latin American militaries. But women are used in combat also in Islamist insurgencies, usually as suicide bombers rather than combatants. So that tells you something, I think, about expendability and the view of women in a lot of those movements in general. But definitely it's a worldwide pattern. And one of the negative aspects of that pattern is thinking about how to make sure that women who are participating in these movements post-war are not forced back into a more retrogressive position. It's also important to note that victory and defeat really matter. So if you are part of a relatively gender equal movement, which is then defeated, it goes a long way for the defeating power to crush that movement and to try and reverse those gains in terms of gender equality, or try and make it very clear that women's position was incorrect. And you see this a little bit in the case of the Sri Lankan case, where the position of women who fought for the Tamil Tigers has been particularly difficult in terms of reintegration into society.
Thank you. Karen Turner actually has a hand up, and I don't know if this was before we posed the question, but if not, unmute yourself and join the conversation.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I put the hand up by mistake. So I'm glad that my question was addressed, because I do think there are gendered issues that we do need to take account of. So I just put up my hand by mistake.
Very good. Well, thank you. Thank you. Let me just pose one very quick last question, and I think Charlie talked about, or at least raised this issue a little earlier. And this has to do with the relationship between feminism and the feminist movement and women and combat. And so, if we think about, let's say, the 1970s or even the 1980s, kind of an earlier stage, yes, you show that there's not a lot of support for these sorts of demands. Does that change over time? Could you talk about the ways in which feminist organizations are part of this process of breaking down barriers and facilitating women's entry into combat positions in more recent years?
Yes, it does change. So I think that around the time that the US is beginning to consider opening combat roles to women, so from 2010 onwards, there is simultaneously the Minerva Project in the US, which is beginning to push again the idea of a lawsuit and saying, okay, well, 30 years roughly have passed since Rotzker versus Goldberg. We should have another go at this. It's done. I think it's at University of Virginia. It's called the Molly Pitcher Project, where they start to begin to push against this. There is a U.S. women's service women organization, which has been very consistently advocating on this very question since the 1970s. As time has gone on, they got more and more receptivity to those arguments. So yes, there has been a feminist and civil society role in a lot of this. It wasn't prominent when it probably mattered the most. And I think that that period of the 1970s that I mentioned, it's really, really interesting, this intersection you have between the reintroduction of the Selective Service Act and the Equal Rights Amendment all happening at the same time, means that it's a bit, sometimes we talk in terms of legal and normative developments about the role of chance. And in that case, that coalescing of events was really unfortunate, because it made it really, really difficult for anyone in the feminist movement who was wanting to push. You were pushing against the idea of the Vietnam War. You were pushing against this wider debate on the Equal Rights Amendment, which was the focus that people wanted to win. So it is really complicated. But yes, as time has gone on, things have definitely shifted. There's always a discomfort, and there will always be a discomfort, particularly in feminist academia, on the question of militarization. And it relates to a lot of the questions that Charlie and Audrey have very thoughtfully asked me, which is, can you alter this very difficult gendered institution by simply adding women into it? And what are the costs and losses of doing that? I think it's important that we continue to consider that. But I revert to the same position I started with, which is, unless women are in there in the first place, then you've got absolutely no hope of making those alterations that we would like to see for a more just military, and ideally a more just world.
Thank you. I unfortunately have to draw this to a close because it's now just past 5:30. So I want to thank Sarah, Charlie, Audrey, and Christian for this conversation. Thanks to those of you in the audience for joining us and for posing questions. Christian, let me turn it back to you for final words.
Yes, just a reminder, next Monday, December 11, we'll be discussing Suharto's Cold War, Indonesia, Southeast Asia, and the world. Thanks again to Sarah, Charlie, Audrey, and Eric for really fascinating, rich discussion. I learned a lot. I hope you viewers out there did too. We're adjourned. Thanks, everyone. Good night.